Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. Have the pleasure to have a whole group of our dairy field specialists here today on our podcast. We have Dr. Larry Tranel from Northeast Southeast Dairy Field Specialist, Fred Hall, our Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, our Ag Engineer who specializes in dairy facilities, Brian Doherty, and on campus, Gail Carpenter, our Associate Professor, who recently joined us here in the past year. So welcome, everybody.
Appreciate that.
All right, so our topic here today is going to be talking about automatic milking systems and how they've changed over the last few years. Larry, I know when I started an extension back in 2010, we actually hosted a field day on a robotic dairy. They were the first ones in Iowa back in 2010. So how has that changed since then? Have we grown?
Yeah, I think I do remember those days back at the Mark and Sandra Earhart farm. We were kind of the first ones to actually install a robotic milking system in Iowa. And so since then, we've actually grown, I think, pretty good with that. It's amazing how 10 years can change things. I look back at pictures of the first robotic milking system back in 1981 that was in Holland, and just how this thing has changed and grown to the point where that first one was installed in 2010. And around 2018, we had about 50 to 55 farms and about 150 robots in Iowa now, or back in 2018. So just, 3 short years ago. So we have probably went from about, 0% to about 5% of them back in 2018 to about 8% of the farms now in Iowa tend to have robots. And so it definitely has grown as part of the industry and part of the technology that we're dealing with to the point where we're going to start seeing, I suspect, some rotary robots. And so it's not that we just have single box robots, but we actually have rotary parlors that tend to have robots with them. So you might see like a 32 or bale rotary or stall rotary that might actually have a robot on each stall. And I've actually had the pleasure to actually tour some of those in Vancouver, Canada one time. So I think that whole issue of robotics, not just on the milking system, but on the feeding systems and some of the other things have changed in the dairy industry as well. So I think Iowa's kind of a big player in robotic milking.
Robots are growing in popularity in Canada, much like they are in the US, especially on those smaller farms, because, they have a lot of labor issues that they have to deal with there, just like we do here. So I don't think they're going anywhere. And I think they do offer an opportunity for a lot of those small farms to be able to stay competitive.
At least in Iowa, we have a lot of older facilities, and people are making decisions about whether or not they're going to move from that tie stall or maybe an outdated parlor to either an updated parlor or robot. So Larry, can you explain a little bit about people's decision-making process with making that transition?
Yes, I've had the pleasure of walking a lot of people through this decision. And the first thing is, when people talk about the profitability of them, is it a cash flow issue? Is it a profitability issue? And we can kind of talk out both sides of our mouth, because when people talk about it, just people have different things in their mind about what they want to try to attain with them. And so when you take a look at the biggest thing, I think is, you got to be very careful about what you're comparing it to. Okay, so if I'm going to compare a robot to an inefficient stall barn system, I can almost guarantee the robot's probably going to look better. When I compare a robot to a high efficient, low cost parlor, it's going to be very competitive, and it's going to be very tough for the robot to actually show that it's more profitable than the low-cost parlor, especially if it's a high-efficient one. But the issue tends to sometimes not be just cost. The issue becomes labor, its availability, labor's flexibility, trying to manage labor and things like that. And so when you take a look at the reasons that robots are being put in, sometimes it's not really a financial decision on profitability. It tends to be more kind of labor-related, that they just can't find labor. So one of the things I just want to make sure people understand when they put robots in is a lot of times they're taking loans out on these robots, and this is maybe a 13 to 15 year life on the robot. Might have to pay it back in like 7 years, so they have some pretty high cash flow needs in those first 7 years. But after the first 7 years are done, then it really lightens up the cash flow, because now they've got the thing paid off, and they still have this taken off their labor for the next 7 or 8 years on top of it. Okay, so very high cash flow needs early on, but after it gets paid off, that cash flow lessens dramatically. But profitability, as you take a look at these things over 15 to 17 years, they can be very competitive with other types of parlor systems and and just other types of milking systems that we have. But the more efficient the milking system you currently have, the more difficult it's going to be to find a robot that's going to be better than that. Okay, so again, there's other reasons, and there's other reasons, I guess, also just in the whole management, as Gail was mentioning, just the management of the herd, whether it be feed ration wise or just a lot of other cow management type things that these robots can definitely assist with a lot of the data that they tend to have of other facets as well. So it's not just that we're comparing against a milking system, we're comparing against kind of a herd management system as well.
Larry, let's really drill down on the labor side of that. Some folks think, well, when we have a robot, we don't have any labor. And that's certainly not the case. We've changed the labor. Can you give us a bit more in depth on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got some robotic milking herds that after they put the robots in, they say they haven't saved much of labor. It's just what they do is a little bit different, and their labor is more flexible, and they don't have to be here at a certain time. So it really changes the labor game on a dairy farm. I think when you take a look at a lot of the different types of costs, and so now they might have labor going into looking at the dashboard or, the computer system that's kind of running it. They might have more labor in trying to do preventive maintenance on the robot, a lot more time maybe to look at their cows. And they also have to, work with their fetch cows and training cows going through the robot. And so, yeah, it definitely saves some labor, because we do realize you can run more cows with the robots than you can with the milking parlor for the same amount of labor and things like that. So we definitely do that. Definitely saves quite a bit of labor. And we've got some data, back in 2012 and 2017, I guess, was the other date that we worked with it, where they were actually saving a high percentage of their labor. So I think back in 2012 they were actually milking about 12% more cows with a 75% decrease in labor. When we did the survey here in Iowa in 2017, they were actually milking 33% more cows with a 55% decrease in milking labor. So I'm just make sure that we're just talking about milking labor there, but again, they're doing a lot of other chores with it as well. So yeah, labor is undoubtedly the biggest piece, and sometimes it actually becomes more important than actually the financial piece of it.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the dashboard and all the numbers that are available with the robots there. One of the things we talk about a lot with precision technologies for producers is information overload. Do you have any experience with coaching people with how to deal with that?
So when we take a look at the information overload, because that can definitely be real. I mean, you can sit at the computer and look at it all darn day, just because of all the information is in there. So I think as people put these robots in, it's nice that when they get up in the morning, what are the top 5 things that they're going to take a look at, because there's cows that need attention. And so they kind of, I think, have a daily schedule of what they need to look at. When they come back, maybe in midday, there's might be 4 or 5 other things that they might take a look at feed management wise or whatever, or the new cows that might have come on, and just making sure that they all have their numbers, because you may want to make sure you don't get a cow that's not supposed to go through the robot and get milk. Definitely a lot of things that they just need to kind of prioritize their time and what's important at this point in time of the day. You can get yourself information overload, but yeah, we need to prioritize what we're going to look at.
Larry had used the term fetch cows. I'm going to bring Brian Doherty, our engineer, into the conversation. Let's talk about what fetch cows are and how facilities can affect that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Fred. So essentially, a fetch cow is any cow that doesn't voluntarily go to the robot to get milk. So you have to go out into the barn and find that cow and bring her to the robot. And facility design can affect that in different ways. So there's sort of some different barn layouts that you can use. You can use what's called a free flow design, where basically cows can just go anywhere they want, anytime they want. It's relying on completely voluntary milking. So that cow has to go to the robot. And in those type of facilities, you do tend to see a little bit higher rate of the number of cows that you need to fetch. There's also guided traffic designs, where basically if that cow, for example, if she wants to go to the feed bunk and eat, it will force her to go through the robot first. So she has more of an incentive to get up and go to the robot. And so you can design those to be either feed first or, stall first. So you can kind of flip the design around to how you want that laid out. But essentially that will reduce your number of fetch cows, because that cow has to go through the robot if she wants to be able to eat or lay down. And there's also sort of a variation on that, a hybrid design with pre-selection. So you have a smart gate, and let's say you have a cow that was just milked 2 hours ago and she's laying down, she wants to get up and go eat again. The system will know that that cow is just milked. She doesn't need to go through the robot again. So it will sort her and allow her to go and eat again rather than having to go back through the robot. So facility design, that's the main way it affects your number of fetch cows, is whether you have a free flow or a guided flow system.
And Brian, I know during the webinar, Jim Sulphur from University of Minnesota was kind of walking us through that fetch cow list. And he actually termed pre-fresh heifers as not necessarily fetch cows. We should just call them trained heifers, spending some time getting them into the robot area or making some type of makeshift area that kind of looks like a box where you're walking them through just to practice, so that when they do get into the robot area, we're not limiting the number of milkings that they're coming through. And he's noticed that that's really helped with maximizing milk production in that first lactation, because some of those heifers can actually lag about 4 weeks before they really feel comfortable in the robot area, and just helping overall increase of visits per day in the robot. You've seen that with robot farms that you've worked with?
Yeah, that's a great point, Jen. So it's definitely a good idea to try to train your heifers ahead of time. And again, facility design can play a role in that. So if you've got a robot set up where you've got some bedded pack or calving pens, an area for your pre-fresh cows where they can directly access that robot, then you can bring your heifers into that area and get them trained to go through the robot before they calve. And that has all of the advantages that you mentioned. So that's a really good idea. The other thing you can do in your fetch pen is put a training gate in. So essentially it's just a hinged gate that you can, just kind of get that heifer up close to the robot and swing that gate behind her and just kind of chain her into that area, and then just let her go through the robot on her own rather than trying to kind of push them through the robot. That just gets them more comfortable with the area, lets them go through on their own time. And that can be a really good way to train your heifers to go through the robot.
So Brian, during the webinar, you shared some slides about what like an ideal robotic milking layout. And I remember the robots were kind of at an angle, and just if you develop an ideal robotic milking system facility wise, what would it look like?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors that can go into that. So there's no such thing as a perfect facility, but generally an ideal barn, you're going to have excellent cow comfort, great access to feed and water, great ventilation. So that really doesn't change, whether it's an AMS facility or just a regular freestall barn. But there's several other design criteria that you really want to have in an AMS facility, because your goal with AMS is voluntary milking. So it's a little bit of a different thought process into how you're going to design that barn. The other thing, we've been talking about fetch cows, so you really have to focus on reducing the number of fetch cows if you want it to be a labor efficient facility. So you need some sort of a foot care facilities, you need a hoof trimming chute, you need a foot bath of some sort, because you really want to focus on limiting lameness, because lameness is one of the things that really drives your number of fetch cows up. You really need to have very simple cow movement. You got to have gating set up so that one person can move a cow from anywhere to anywhere in that facility by themselves. And again, that's a big piece of that labor efficiency. A lot of these things I've talked about, good barn design, handling facilities, good gating, flexible areas for separation before and after the robot would be part of a kind of an ideal barn. Bedded pack for your fresh cows and your lame cows is a really good idea, just to get them off the concrete. And ideally, you would have that located behind one of your robots. So you've got calving pens, pre-fresh pens, and then a bedded pack for your fresh cows, all just kind of lined up behind the robot for what's they call like a stress-free calving line. And so they can access that robot without having to be out in the main barn and competing with all of the other cows. So all of those factors go into it. One more that isn't really feasible in a retrofit is perimeter feeding. So instead of just having feed alley down the center, or maybe a 3-row barn with feeding on one side, you actually have feed alleys on the outside edges of the barn. And that can have a lot of advantages for adding feed bunk space, and can just work really well if you can locate your robots in the center of the barn. But generally, that's only going to be for a new facility, probably not something you can work into a retrofit. That's just kind of a general list of, the things you would want to see in what we'd call an ideal barn.
We're seeing herds kind of pushing that limit on the number of cows per pen or per robot. I think when we first started, we were closer to that 60 cows per robot. And now we have herds that are pushing near that 70, maybe even more than that. What's driving that number up, and how are those farms still maximizing throughput, the number of visits, and still getting that production?
I'll take a first stab at it. I guess when you start taking a look at those numbers of getting into 70 cows per robot, still getting high production. It's just as people get more experience with robots, they're really tending to find, what cows really tend to work. So you're not going to have cows that are going to be wasting time in the robot. And so sometimes early on, it takes a while for us to figure out who those cows are. And so some cows adapt to these robots better than others. And so as you start taking a look at herds that have really culling selection has really defined, based on how well they work with the robot. I mean, I think that's probably the number one way that they actually are able to get more cows through the robot, more pounds of milk per day through the robot. But as Brian was mentioning, all those things about facilities, that facility design also has to play a major factor into that as well, because you get well-designed facilities with a well-selected herd of cows. Okay, you can still get a lot of milk production off high numbers of cows per robot. We also have the flip side is that sometimes you're actually getting more milk with fewer cows. And so we kind of got to balance that as well, is that sometimes we've got herds that it can actually, drop a few cows per robot and actually increase milk production from that same robot with fewer numbers of cows. So it's quite a delicate balance, I would say.
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there. There's milk per cow, which is important, but milk per robot is also an important metric to look at in these facilities. And sometimes, you may be able to add a few more cows and actually get your milk per robot number higher. If you can get, say, 70 cows a day through that robot versus 60, that's going to drive that number up, which also is a component of that overall efficiency and profitability.
The more time cows spend at the bunk, the more healthy their rumens are, the more milk fat they'll be producing, the higher their de novos will be. So a lot of it does come back to those basics of making sure that cows have free feed access to the bunk and they have adequate lying space. And a lot of it just ties back down to cow comfort and promoting those natural cow behaviors.
And I think I would add into that when we take a look at feed bunk space, and so historically we've had the 24 inches of feed bunk space. We've definitely shown in some 3-row freestall barns, even without robots, that as long as they feeding practices kosher, that they can actually, get pretty decent dry matter intakes, even with 18 inches. And then we've got some robotic milking systems that are starting to push this down to 15 inches. I was actually consulting on one. I was trying to get it down to 12 inches. I don't feel comfortable with there at all yet. But the 15 inches, I would only feel comfortable there if it's an automatic feeding system, or if they get some kind of a feed pusher upper that's automatic going through there every couple hours. But typically to get them down to 18, it probably isn't too difficult with the robot. But to start pushing that envelope a little bit more, there's other things that have to happen if we're going to push that envelope, because those cows need time to eat, and they not just have time, they need that space. Take a look at boss cows and just getting pushed away from the feed bunk and things like that. I think an ideal system is this when cows can just eat there without being very well interrupted. But
the more limited you are in bunk space, the more important some of those basic feed management practices, such as push up and feeding twice a day, become. Limiting sorting, all of those, again, back to basics things that we learned about in Intro to Nutrition become increasingly important as you have more limited bunk space.
Yeah, one thing to consider with AMS facilities is the feeding behavior does change a little bit. So, I certainly wouldn't encourage people, as Larry mentioned, to get much below 18 inches, per cow. But if you think about a regular, freestall barn with a milking parlor in it, you milk the herd and all those cows generally want to go up and eat at once after milking. So it's just absolutely critical in that situation to have enough bunk space. Whereas in an AMS facility, those cows are just, they're being milked around the clock. It's a little bit more of a natural kind of behavior of the cows. They can get up and eat when they feel like it. So you don't tend to see as many cows up and trying to eat at the same time in an AMS facility versus a regular. So you may be able to get away with a little bit less bunk space. But again, I wouldn't encourage trying to push that too far, because you could end up hurting feed intake in that case.
So Gail, as a follow-up question to the feed bunk conversation and kind of maximizing, dry matter intake on those cows, what are you seeing for research out in the industry right now?
So there's a really interesting study that just came out of Canada. And again, Canada and the US aren't necessarily apples and oranges. So they have bigger cows up there in Canada, a different production system up there. There's several differences between the Canadian and the US dairy system, but they did some surveys and some benchmarking of farms across Canada. And a couple of the interesting rules of thumb that they found within those studies was, first of all, increasing that frequency of push-up was associated with more higher levels of production. So one of the rules of thumbs they provided was that for every 5 additional push-ups, feed push-ups that you have throughout the day, that's the equivalent about 3/4 of a pound more milk per cow. And the other thing that they found was that bunk space was highly correlated. So they do provide, again, larger cows up there. So they'll have more bunk space in general available. So their average across the study was actually 25 inches, which is quite a bit bigger than what we've been discussing here. But they found that for every 4 inches of bunk space, additional bunk space that you provide, that's the equivalent of about 2/3 of a pound more milk. So again, we're going to have some biological limits on that. Obviously, we can't provide 50 inches of bunk space and expect per cow and expect to, magically be producing 200 pounds of milk a day or something like that. But those were some interesting findings that they found in that survey study. Another interesting, maybe a little bit off topic, but some recent research that's been published out of commercial AMS systems is that feeding molasses to fresh cows has a lot of positive benefits in terms of their metabolic health. So lower BHBs, lower ketone bodies, cows are less likely to have repeat incidents of ketosis, and they lose less body condition in early lactation if they're provided some additional molasses with their pellet at the feed bunk. So I think we're learning a lot more about the importance of feed management and promoting overall metabolic and rumen health to those cows.
So Gail, I think it's important what you mentioned, especially with the feed bunk space, because we do tend to find that, people are saying, well, take a look and we can look at time-lapse video about how much, difference there is as we go into those smaller and smaller inches of feed bunk space per cow. But I think that research kind of shows us quite dramatically that feed bunk space is still pretty darn important, and we should not shortchange our cows of feed bunk space.
Absolutely.
Jim Sulphur talked a little bit about this at the webinar, and we've talked today a lot about bunk management. He also pointed out that it's even more important to make sure your quality of forage is where it needs to be. Gail, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'd never disagree with Jim Sulphur on anything, and he's absolutely right there. Yes. So much always comes down to forage quality, especially with AMS, and especially once you're talking about managing those bunks and making sure that every bite that a cow eats is consistent, high quality. We really want to emphasize that rumen health, especially when we're using a pellet plus a PMR at the bunk.
Well, Fred, I was going to ask you a question. I mean, what are you seeing with robots out in the northwest side of the state?
There's at least one new facility that is going up with robots in it. The folks who are using them, we've only had one that had a problem, and that went back to when they were installing it. Tell you, a lot of positive comments, a lot of milk. Robots, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but robots tend to clean up some milk, and robots tend to get a few more pounds of milk.
Yeah, so when you take a look at, the Semitic cell counts do tend to go down by about 5%, so they do, but early on they actually tend to go up, and there definitely are some herds where we've got some problems with Semitic cell count on the herds, but yeah, the milk does definitely tends to go up with it. And I think the other thing I would kind of mention is, Gail mentioned like in Canada with some of the smaller farms, we actually start to see some of our larger farms here in Iowa go towards robots. So we've got some farms with 6, 8, 10 robots, 12 robots on them.
Well, we've had some great discussion here today talking about automatic milking systems. As we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Just if producers have questions, don't be afraid to give us some contact with it, because we definitely have some experience with it, both on the economic side about whether good investments or facility side, and some of the nutrition aspects with it as well.
And I would just add that, I know we're having a conversation here about automated milking, but don't forget about cow comfort. That's still, to me, the number one priority. So if you're thinking about going to an AMS design and you've got some cow comfort challenges with your current barn, I would either address those first or at least at the same time, when you do your construction, because that's going to hold you back. Otherwise, AMS will not fix any of your cow comfort issues in your barn. And then if you're thinking about, retrofitting into an existing facility, just make sure you're thinking about what your long-term goal is for how that facility will work and how cows will move through that facility, because sometimes when you retrofit, you have to still be able to get your cows milk, so you tend to locate that robot where it doesn't cause much disruption, and that might be great in the short term, but it could end up hurting you in the long term. So you might want to spend a little bit more effort and a little bit more money up front to get that robot located in a good place so that you have a successful facility in the long run.
I'd say anybody who's taken a introduction to nutrition course has learned about the ration on paper versus the ration in the bunk versus the ration that the cow eats. And it's especially important when we're dealing with automatic milking systems that we keep the ration that the cow actually eats as consistent with what's on paper as possible. So using some of those back to basics ideas of adequate bunk space, adequate feed push-up, making sure that we're limiting the opportunity to sort feed is just as important, if not more important, in AMS systems than conventional systems.
Well, thanks for those closing comments. I think those are good takeaway points here today. If you need more information, we do have quite a bit of automatic milking system references on our Dairy Extension team webpage. Just Google Dairy Extension Iowa State University, and you should be able to find quite a few of those resources. I will link the webinar that we hosted this past week that focused on the automatic milking systems along with this podcast. So if you want to view that, there's a lot of good information there from Jim Salfer as well from University of Minnesota, as he was on our webinar, as well as Larry and Brian here were on that webinar too. So thanks for being on the podcast, Gail, Larry, and Fred and Brian.
Thanks for having us, Jen.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks for joining us today and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.